Welcome. In this session, we will master how to configure and manage a Microsoft Entra tenant, specifically focusing on evaluating effective permissions for Entra roles. We will move from core concepts to advanced scoping, privileged identity management, and auditing strategies. Let's get started. To begin evaluating effective permissions, we must first define what a role assignment actually is. As you see in the first bullet, a role assignment isn't just a label, it is a resource that attaches a specific definition to a user or principal at a specific scope. Look at the second point. Effective permissions are always a combination of three things. Who is the security principal? What actions are listed in the role definition? And critically, at what scope tenant or specific resource does this apply? We also distinguish between built-in roles provided by Microsoft and custom roles you define to meet specific needs. We do this to strictly adhere to the principle of least privilege, ensuring admins have exactly the access they need, and no more. This diagram visualizes the equation of a role assignment. On the left, we start with the security principal, which can be a user, group, or service principal. Below that, we have the role definition, which is simply the collection of permissions like read or write. These feed into the central role assignment node. However, notice the input from scope at the bottom. The assignment is incomplete without defining the boundaries, such as the whole tenant or a specific administrative unit. Only when these three combine do we achieve the output on the right, effective access to resources. Now that we've defined roles, let's explore how Microsoft Entra ID technically calculates effective permissions during a request. Referring to the first bullet, when an admin attempts an action, the system first evaluates role memberships referenced in their access token. It is critical to note, as shown in the second point, that this evaluation looks for both direct assignments to the user and indirect assignments inherited through group membership. The system then performs a match. Does the role held by the user actually contain the specific API action being requested? As the final bullet explains, this is a binary decision. If the action isn't present in the role at the correct scope, the effective permission is null and access is denied. This sequence diagram breaks down the authentication flow. First, the user or service principal sends a request with a token to the Microsoft Graph API. Next, Entra ID begins the evaluation phase. In Step 3, it aggregates all roles assigned directly or via groups. In Step 4, it strictly compares the requested action against those roles within the specific scope. Finally, we see the decision branch. If the specific action exists within the user's effective roles, access is granted. Otherwise, it returns an access denied response. Evaluating effective permissions requires checking the scope. As the first bullet notes, scope defines the boundary where permissions apply. A major component of this is the administrative unit, or O. As seen in the second bullet, O allow you to grant a role like user administrator that only applies to a specific department, not the whole company. We can go even more granular. The third point highlights resource scope, where a role applies only to a single application. Why do we do this? As the final bullet explains, it allows for granular delegation, like letting a helpdesk admin manage only their region's users, drastically reducing the blast radius of a compromised account. This diagram illustrates the hierarchy of scopes. At the top, we have the tenant scope. If you are assigned a role here, your effective permissions extend to all users and apps in the directory. Below that, we see the administrative unit scope. This is a subset. Permissions here only affect members inside that specific unit. Finally, on the right, we have resource scope. This is the narrowest constraint, where effective permissions apply to only one object, such as a specific application registration. When evaluating permissions, we must account for privileged identity management, or PIM. As stated in the first bullet, PIM moves us away from permanent access to just-in-time access. The second bullet introduces a critical distinction: active assignments versus eligible assignments. This impacts your evaluation significantly. As noted in the third bullet, user with an eligible assignment does not effectively have standing permissions. They must perform an action to get them. Finally, PIM adds governance layers, requiring MFA or approval before those effective permissions are generated for a limited time window. This state diagram demonstrates the PIM lifecycle. A user starts in the eligible state. In this state, they have no standing access. If you query their current token, they lack admin privileges. When they need to work, they trigger an activation request. Upon satisfying requirements like MFA, they transition to the active state. It is only in this active state box that they possess effective permissions. Once the time expires, they automatically revert to eligible, removing those permissions. How do we find who has what permissions right now? We use the Discovery and Insights feature mentioned in the first bullet. This tool provides a snapshot of all privileged role assignments. As the second bullet explains, its primary value is identifying users who have permanent access and shouldn't allowing you to convert them to PIM eligible status. However, as noted in the third bullet, use this discovery to ensure you exclude your emergency break glass accounts from eligibility requirements to prevent lockouts. This tool transforms raw data into actionable security hardening. This chart represents a typical visualization from the Discovery and Insights tool. The largest slice we want to reduce is permanent, high-risk access. Our goal is to shift the majority of these users into the eligible, PIM-managed slice, ensuring they only have effective permissions when needed. The small slice represents our emergency access accounts, which must remain permanent but monitored. Once permissions are configured, how do we ensure they remain correct? We use access reviews. As the first bullet states, this process recertifies access to prevent permission creep. You can target various resources, as listed in the second bullet. This includes groups, enterprise apps, and privileged PIM roles. Crucially, you don't have to do this alone. The third bullet highlights that you can delegate the decision to managers or let users self-attest to their needs. The final result is automated governance. If access is denied during the review, the system automatically revokes the role assignment or group membership, removing the effective permissions. This journey maps the access review lifecycle. It begins in the initiation phase, where an admin defines the frequency and scope. It moves to attestation, where the reviewer, perhaps a manager, or the user evaluates the need for continued access. Finally, in remediation, the system acts on these decisions. If access is denied, the system automatically removes the role assignment, cutting off effective permissions, and logs the event for auditing. Finally, we must continuously monitor effective permissions. The first bullet points to audit logs, which are essential for tracking the life cycle of assignments and PIM activations. We pair this with sign-in logs, mentioned in the second bullet, to verify if permissions are actually being used or if they are stale. For automation, as seen in the third bullet, we can leverage the Microsoft Graph API to pull role assignment reports and analyze permissions programmatically. This continuous loop helps us enforce the principle of least privilege by identifying and removing unused high-level roles. This flowchart summarizes the monitoring strategy. We ingest data from activity sources on the left. PIM activations flow into audit logs, while actual usage flows into sign-in logs. These feed into our analysis engine, which could be a manual review or a SIEM tool. The outcomes are actionable. If access is unused, we remove the role. If it's suspicious, we alert security. And if it's verified as necessary, we retain permissions.